She was paid to marry a dying millionaire, but he survived and wanted her forever. She thought it was just a deal, 1 year, one contract, one dying man. But when he lived, love became the one thing neither of them could control. Hello, everyone. Subscribe now to keep these stories of love loss and redemption alive. Comment your city so we can feel how far our hearts travel. Every click helps another soul believe in love again. Now let's continue with the story. New York City shimmered in the chill of late November. The streets glowed with golden lights, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted from food carts. Evelyn Brooks hurried down Lexington Avenue, her hospital badge still clipped to her coat. Her shift had ended an hour ago, but her mind was still spinning with the image of her little sister asleep in the pediatric ward. The surgery bill sat heavy in her bag numbers she could never reach on a nurse's salary. When the phone buzzed, she almost ignored it, but the message made her stop cold. Miss Brooks, I'm Richard Hale, legal representative of Mr. Nathaniel Cross. Please meet me tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. private matter. She frowned. Nathaniel Cross. Even people who didn't follow business news knew that name. CEO of Cross Holdings real estate tycoon, a man once called the heartless genius of Wall Street. Rumors said he had collapsed months ago from heart failure and disappeared from the public eye. Evelyn deleted the text, told herself it must be spam, but that night she couldn't sleep. The next morning she stood in the lobby of a high-rise overlooking Central Park. The air smelled of cedar and money. Richard Hale, a tall man in a gray suit, greeted her with the precision of a banker. Miss Brooks, he said, Mr. Cross has a proposal that may solve your financial difficulties. She stiffened. I'm not interested in handouts. This isn't charity, Richard replied. It's a contract marriage. Evelyn blinked. I'm sorry, what? Mr. Cross recently underwent surgery. His doctors gave him uncertain odds. He wishes to finalize his estate and remain legally married for at least 1 year. In return, you'd receive full coverage for your sister's surgery, a house allowance, and $1 million after the term ends. Evelyn stared at the document sliding across the marble table. Her throat tightened. Every instinct screamed no, but the thought of her sister pale and hooked to monitors pushed the word back down. Why me, she asked quietly. Richard adjusted his glasses. Because you don't belong to his world. You won't pretend to love him for what he owns. Evelyn exhaled shakily. What does he expect from me? Discretion, Richard said simply. And honesty. That evening, Evelyn stood on the rooftop of her small apartment in Queens. Below, the city pulsed with life taxis, honking music floating from open windows. She looked up at the winter sky, the stars faint behind the city haze. Mom, she whispered, I don't know if this is right, but maybe it's the only way. Her phone buzzed again, a calendar invite from Richard Hale private wedding ceremony, location Cross Estate, Hudson Valley. Evelyn closed her eyes. The decision was made. Some choices weren't about love. They were about survival, and sometimes survival had its own kind of courage. The Hudson Valley looked like a painting that winter morning. Frost clung to the pine trees, and the Cross Estate rose from the mist like an old-world mansion in a dream. Evelyn's heart pounded as the car rolled up the long driveway lined with lanterns. She stepped out, clutching her coat tighter. The cold bit through her gloves. Everything around her whispered money marble steps, silver fixtures, a silence so deep it felt like even the wind had to ask permission to pass. Richard Hale met her at the entrance. Mr. Cross is expecting you, he said in his usual calm tone. Inside, the house smelled faintly of oak and sterilized air, a mix of luxury and hospital memory. Evelyn followed Richard down a hall filled with old photographs, each frame capturing the same man through the years, confident, untouchable, until the last one where his eyes seemed almost tired. The door to the study opened. Nathaniel Cross stood by the window, his tailored black suit sharp against the pale morning light. He didn't turn right away, but she could see the outline of a medical patch near his collarbone, the faint reminder of a heart that had once failed him. You're early. His voice came low and precise. I was told punctuality mattered to you, she replied softly. That made him glance back. Their eyes met hers, cautious but steady, his unreadable gray, like a frozen river. Richard cleared his throat. Mr. Cross, this is Miss Brooks. She's agreed to the terms. Nathaniel finally faced her, his expression calm but distant. Do you understand what this arrangement means? Yes, she said. No feelings, no questions. 1 year. A flicker crossed his face, surprise, maybe admiration. You'll find most people don't speak that plainly here, he murmured. I'm not most people. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the antique clock. Then Nathaniel nodded once. The ceremony will be tomorrow. Simple, quiet, no guests. As she turned to leave, he added, "Miss Brooks, don't expect this house to feel like home." Evelyn paused at the door, her voice steady though her chest tightened. "Don't worry, Mr. Cross. I stopped expecting home a long time ago." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the stone driveway in white. From the window above, Nathaniel watched her car disappear down the road, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt something stir in the silence he'd lived with for far too long. The wedding took less than 10 minutes. No music, no guests, no photographs. Just a quiet ceremony in the Cross Estate Library under the pale glow of winter sunlight filtering through frosted glass. Evelyn wore a simple ivory dress that brushed her knees. Nathaniel stood beside her in a charcoal suit, his hand steady as he signed the papers that would make them husband and wife. It felt less like a wedding and more like a transaction. When the officiant left, Richard closed the folder neatly. "Congratulations," he said politely. Neither of them replied. Nathaniel turned toward her, his tone calm, almost businesslike. "Your room is down the east corridor. You'll have everything you need." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you." "There are rules," he continued. Her chest tightened. "Of course there are," she murmured. That evening, she unpacked in silence. Her room overlooked the frozen lake, and in the reflection of the window, she could see the faint outline of the man down the hall, Nathaniel pacing his office like a restless shadow. She didn't know what haunted him, but she could feel it, the tension of a man who had built empires and suddenly found himself at war with his own heart. At dinner, the table was long enough for 20, yet only 2 seats were filled. Silverware gleamed untouched beneath the chandelier. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "This arrangement isn't personal. You'll continue your work at the hospital if you wish. My staff will manage your schedule." Evelyn cut her steak quietly. "Fine. I don't plan on being in your way." He glanced up, then gray eyes meeting hers, a faint spark of challenge between them. "I don't need sympathy, Miss Brooks, and I don't offer it, Mr. Cross." The air grew heavier. Then, to her surprise, he almost smiled, the ghost of one faint but real. "Good. Maybe this will work after all." Weeks passed. They lived under the same roof, yet their worlds barely touched. She left early for her shifts. He worked late in his study. They exchanged polite greetings, but beneath every word lay an invisible line neither dared to cross. One evening, Evelyn came home to find the hall filled with murmurs. Men in suits, members of the Cross Holdings Board, had gathered in the parlor. Their laughter was low cautious, the kind used when money and pride shared a table. As she passed, she caught one whisper, "Poor girl doesn't even know the stakes." Her steps faltered. Richard noticed and gently motioned her away. "Don't take it personally," he said quietly. "They think this marriage is just a move to keep him in power." "Isn't it?" she asked. Richard sighed. "Maybe once, but lately, I'm not so sure." Later that night, Evelyn found Nathaniel on the terrace, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the wind tugging at his coat. "You shouldn't be out here," she said softly. "It's below freezing." "I like the cold," he replied. "It reminds me I'm still alive." She hesitated, then joined him. "You're fighting them, aren't you, the board?" He turned slightly, the corner of his mouth tightening. "They want control of the company. If I step down before the fiscal year ends, they'll tear it apart for profit. And the marriage keeps them from doing that." "Exactly." Evelyn looked out over the frozen lake, the moonlight glinting off its surface like glass. "So, this is your battlefield." He glanced at her. "And you." "Why did you say yes, Miss Brooks?" She smiled faintly, a tired, honest smile. "Because sometimes love isn't the only thing worth saving." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer felt cold, just uncertain, like the first breath before spring. Winter held Hudson Valley in a quiet grip. Days melted into the hush of snow and the hum of fireplaces. Inside the Cross Estate, life followed a rhythm both distant and strangely intimate. Evelyn had stopped keeping count of the weeks. She still worked weekend shifts at St. Grace Hospital, yet she always returned to a house that felt suspended between warmth and silence. Some nights she'd hear the faint notes of a piano drifting through the halls, melancholy melodies that didn't match the image of a ruthless CEO. One afternoon, she found Nathaniel in the greenhouse behind the east wing. He stood among the orchid sleeves, rolled his usually polished shoes, dusted with soil. For a moment, he looked nothing like the man she'd married. "I didn't think you liked plants," she said, stepping inside. He glanced over his shoulder. I don't. They keep dying on me. Evelyn smiled softly, walking toward the small table near the window. That's because you overwater them. Most roots suffocate from too much care. He raised a brow. Interesting metaphor coming from a nurse. She shrugged. Living things don't need constant control, Mr. Cross. They just need consistency. The following week, Evelyn came home from another long shift. Her hands ached, and the fatigue in her bones reminded her why she'd agreed to this impossible deal. As she entered the kitchen, a rich scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air. She blinked. The billionaire who once hired private chefs was standing by the stove apron, on brow furrowed. You cook? She asked, surprised. I'm attempting to, he muttered, turning a little too late before the sauce boiled over. She rushed to help, grabbing the pot handle, laughing under her breath. Step aside. You're about to ruin dinner. He did reluctantly. When they finally sat down, the chicken wasn't perfect, but it was warm, and for the first time they ate together like ordinary people. Nathaniel poured her a glass of wine. Do you always fix things, Evelyn? It's kind of my job, she said, smiling. He studied her across the table. You don't act like someone who took a deal for money. Her eyes met his. I didn't. I took it for time my sister might not have if I hadn't. Nathaniel nodded slowly. No clever remark followed, just the quiet understanding of two people carrying invisible battles. That night, a storm rolled over the valley. Lightning flashed through the windows, and when the lights went out, the mansion fell into total darkness. Evelyn found Nathaniel standing in the hallway, motionless, his breath quick and shallow. It's all right, she said gently. It's just the power. He didn't answer. The faint tremor in his hands told her this was more than discomfort. Without thinking, she reached for his arm. Hey, look at me. Breathe. His eyes flicked toward her, and for a second he looked like a lost boy instead of a man who owned half of New York. The dark, he whispered. I can't. Evelyn took his hand, guided him to the sofa near the window, where moonlight still touched the floor. She sat beside him, voice soft and steady. Do you want me to tell you a story? He nodded once, and she began something simple, a bedtime tale she used to tell her sister when hospital machines beeped through the night. Her words slowed the rhythm of his breathing. When the storm faded, his head leaned back, his shoulders no longer tense. For the first time since she'd met him, Nathaniel Cross was asleep, peaceful, unguarded human. When Evelyn rose to leave, she noticed the chow of lavender on the side table wilting, neglected, forgotten among polished glass. She poured the last bit of her water bottle into the soil and whispered, Don't die on me yet. From the shadows of the hall, Nathaniel stirred, half awake. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed her, and in the dim light, the lavender seemed to breathe again. Spring crept slowly into Hudson Valley. Snow melted from the edges of the stone steps, and sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Cross estate like a long-awaited guest. The air smelled different now, a mix of rain soil and something lighter, almost like hope. Evelyn noticed the change first in the lavender. Tiny buds began to bloom again, their soft purple petals reaching for the morning light. She smiled every time she passed it, and somewhere deep down she believed Nathaniel saw it too. Their conversations had grown easier. He still worked late in his study, but sometimes he'd stop by the kitchen just to ask what she was reading or to steal a sip of the coffee she'd brewed for herself. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something warmer than the distance that had once filled every room. One morning she was leaving for the hospital when Richard Hale appeared in the foyer. He looked troubled, his briefcase clutched tighter than usual. Miss Brooks, he said, lowering his voice. May I have a word? Nathaniel was in the next room, but the tension in Richard's tone made her nod. They stepped outside near the fountain. The board is getting impatient, Richard said quietly. They don't believe Mr. Cross will make it through the year without stepping down. I thought the marriage protected his position, Evelyn replied. It did, Richard sighed, but rumors spread fast when feelings get involved. She frowned. What do you mean? Richard hesitated. There are people watching you. Someone leaked photos from the hospital you tending to him in recovery. They're twisting it into a scandal. If this goes public, it could ruin both of you. That evening, she confronted Nathaniel in his office. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, and the reflection of both of them flickered like ghosts. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded softly. He didn't look up from the papers. There's nothing to tell. They're saying this marriage is fake, that you paid me to protect your company. Didn't I? His voice was flat, unfeeling. The words cut like glass. Yes, but that's not all it is anymore, is it? Finally, he looked at her eyes, tired, guarded, as if he'd built another wall overnight. You're confusing gratitude for love, Evelyn. Don't make that mistake. Her throat tightened. Then what about you? Why do you keep me here if none of this matters? He stood his posture sharp as armor. Because this arrangement works. Because feelings ruin everything. Evelyn took a shaky breath. You're scared. Nathaniel laughed once without humor. Of you don't flatter yourself. No, she whispered of losing control, of being human again. The silence after that was unbearable. She turned to leave, but his voice followed colder than the night air. This conversation is over. Down the hall, the lavender sat near the window, its petals half closed, like it knew the warmth was fading again. Evelyn packed her overnight bag for the hospital. She couldn't stay in that house another night. Her hand trembled as she folded the note she left on the table. I never asked for love, Nathaniel, but I hoped you'd at least tell me the truth. The next morning, Nathaniel found the note beside her empty chair. The untouched cup of coffee had gone cold. He stared at it for a long time until Richard entered the room. She left, Nathaniel said quietly. Richard nodded. She needed space. We all do sometimes. But when Richard left, Nathaniel sank into the chair and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices press against his chest like a real sickness. Outside, rain began to fall, washing away the last of the snow from the garden. The lavender bent under the droplets, fragile yet unbroken. Days turned into weeks. Evelyn stayed longer at the hospital, avoiding calls from the estate. Rumors spread. Articles whispered that Cross Holdings was collapsing under scandal. She pretended not to care, but every headline felt like a bruise she couldn't hide. Then late one night, she heard a nurse mention a patient transferred to their ward, a man in his 40s with chest complications. When she saw the name on the chart, her heart stopped. Nathaniel Cross. He'd been admitted quietly, under an alias. And as she stood frozen in the corridor, the truth hit her harder than any rumor ever could. He hadn't just broken her trust. He'd broken himself. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Gray clouds lingered above the city, blurring the skyline outside St. Grace Hospital. Evelyn walked the long corridor toward the private wing, her shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. Room 312. She hesitated before opening the door. Nathaniel lay against crisp white sheets, an oxygen tube tracing a line across his face. Monitors hummed beside him, steady alive. For a moment she just stood there, the weight of everything between them pressing down like the heavy air before a storm. You shouldn't be here, came his faint voice. He hadn't opened his eyes, but somehow he knew. Evelyn stepped closer. I'm still your wife legally anyway. His lips curved slightly tired. I told them not to call you. I found out, she said. You're not as invisible as you think. Nathaniel turned his head, finally meeting her gaze. There was no sharpness left, no armor, only exhaustion and something that looked a lot like regret. I pushed too hard, he said quietly. Didn't listen to the warnings. Guess I thought if I kept moving, I'd outrun the truth. And what truth is that, she asked? That money doesn't buy peace. And that I might have been a better man if I'd let you stay. Evelyn's throat tightened. She looked down at his hand resting on the blanket, still strong, despite the wires and tape. I didn't want your money, Nathaniel, she said softly. I just wanted honesty. I know. His voice broke on the words. That's what scared me. The beeping of the monitor filled the silence between them. Evelyn pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. They didn't talk for a while. There was no need to. Sometimes healing begins in the spaces words can't reach. Over the next week, she visited every evening after her shift. She changed his IV, adjusted his pillows, read to him when the nights grew too quiet. They never mentioned the contract. They didn't have to. One night, she brought something small wrapped in tissue paper. When he opened it, he found a tiny sprig of lavender cut from the plant back at the mansion, still faintly fragrant. It's from home, she said. He looked at it for a long time, his thumb brushing against the petals. I didn't know it could survive that long. Maybe it just needed the right kind of light, she said. Nathaniel smiled, a real one this time, the kind that softened every edge of him. As the days passed, his strength began to return. He walked short laps in the corridor, nodded politely to the nurses, and always stopped by the window to look at the rain. Funny, he said one afternoon when I had everything I never noticed weather. Now I'm grateful just to see the sky. Evelyn watched him quietly. In the soft hospital light, he looked nothing like the man she had married for a contract. He looked like someone who had finally learned how to live. When she left that night, he called after her. Evelyn, he said, voice steady, if I ever get out of here, I want to start over properly this time. She turned at the door, her eyes glistening, but her smile gentle. We'll see if the lavender blooms again first. Outside, the rain had stopped. Puddles shimmered under the streetlights, reflecting the city's glow like liquid glass. Evelyn walked home in the quiet, the scent of lavender still clinging to her hands. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like running away. She just felt still. Summer came softly to Hudson Valley. The air smelled of rain and warm earth, and the Cross estate, once silent, as stone now echoed with the faint sound of life again. Windows were open, curtains fluttered. The lavender by the east window stood tall, its scent drifting gently through the halls. Nathaniel had returned home 2 months after his discharge. He moved slower, now calmer, no longer chasing time as if it owed him something. Every morning he walked the garden paths, hands in pockets, eyes lifted toward the sunlight that used to annoy him. Sometimes he'd stop by the lavender brush, his fingers over the blooms, and whisper something no one else could hear. But Evelyn wasn't there. She'd taken a position at a community clinic in Boston, far from the mansion, far from everything that used to hurt. Nathaniel hadn't seen her since the hospital, though. Every week, a small envelope arrived with no return address inside one pressed lavender petal. On a warm July morning, Richard Hale appeared at the estate. He found Nathaniel in the study surrounded by paperwork and quiet music. "You're selling your shares?" Richard asked, scanning the documents. "I'm donating most of them," Nathaniel replied, "to fund medical programs at St. Grace and other hospitals." Richard blinked. "That's half your company, Nathaniel." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time I invest in something that lasts longer than profit." Richard studied him for a moment, then said carefully, "She doesn't know, does she?" Nathaniel looked out the window. "She will when it matters." Weeks later, Evelyn arrived at the Boston clinic early one morning. The lobby buzzed with activity. New volunteers, new patients, and a flurry of excitement she didn't understand until her co-worker handed her a flyer. The Cross Foundation grand opening of the Boston Children's Wing. Her breath caught. She read the smaller line beneath the title, "Dedicated to those who remind us to live again." Her hands trembled. The event was that afternoon. The auditorium shimmered under soft golden light. Reporters lined the back rows. Nurses and families filled the front. Evelyn slipped in quietly, staying near the exit. Then she saw him standing on stage, speaking with that familiar calm that once hid everything he felt. Nathaniel's voice carried through the room. "For a long time I believed second chances were myths, something money couldn't buy, and people didn't give. But sometimes life surprises you. Sometimes a stranger saves you not with medicine, but with compassion you didn't think you deserved." His eyes swept the crowd and found hers. The words faltered for a heartbeat before he continued. "This foundation exists because one person reminded me that living isn't measured in years or dollars. It's measured in moments when your heart chooses kindness over fear." Evelyn's chest tightened. Tears blurred her vision as the room erupted in applause. Nathaniel stepped off the stage, but instead of greeting the officials waiting for him, he walked straight toward her. They stood face to face in the aisle, the noise fading around them. Neither spoke at first. The months apart melted into that single fragile second. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said softly. "I almost didn't," she whispered. He smiled, the same small, genuine smile she remembered from the hospital. "I meant what I said. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Evelyn. I'm asking for a chance to prove I finally learned how to live." She looked up at him, eyes shining with something between relief and disbelief. "And if I say yes, then I'll spend whatever time I have left making sure you never regret it." For a moment, the world stilled. Then she stepped forward and hugged him, not out of pity, but out of something deeper, quieter, like forgiveness, finally exhaling. When they pulled apart, he reached into his pocket and handed her a small pouch. Inside was a single lavender seed. "It survived the winter," he said. "Thought maybe we could plant a new one together." The late summer air was warm, heavy, with the scent of cut grass and blooming lavender. The Cross estate looked different now, windows open, laughter echoing faintly through halls that once held only silence. Evelyn had returned for good. She still worked part-time at the Boston clinic, but on weekends she came back to the valley, to the house that no longer felt like a contract, but like a place that had learned how to breathe again. Nathaniel kept his promise. He'd turned a portion of his estate into a children's therapy center, inviting doctors, nurses, and volunteers from all over the state. Every corner of the mansion carried a hum of life. Yet the lavender garden remained their quiet world, the place where words didn't have to fill every space. It was where they planted the new lavender seed together, hands and soil, laughter breaking through the soft hum of summer cicadas. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, Evelyn found Nathaniel sitting on the stone bench near the pond. He wore a white shirt sleeves, rolled his tie, forgotten beside him. The light reflected in his eyes, gold and gentle. "You look peaceful," she said, sitting next to him. He smiled. "That's new for me. You've changed. Or maybe I just stopped fighting the wrong things." She turned toward him. The wrong things. The fear of needing someone, the fear of being seen as weak. Evelyn brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve, her voice soft. "Needing someone doesn't make you weak, Nathaniel. It makes you real." He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no trace of the cold, distant man she had met that winter. Only gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. Later that night, a storm rolled in, but instead of fear, the rain brought warmth. They stayed inside the conservatory, watching droplets race down the glass walls. Thunder rumbled far away. Nathaniel reached for her hand, hesitant at first, as if asking permission. When she didn't pull away, he said quietly, "You know, I used to think contracts kept life safe, everything defined, controlled, predictable, but they only made it smaller." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And now I want things I can't control, like the way you laugh, or how you talk to flowers as if they're listening." She laughed softly. "Maybe they are." He leaned closer, his voice lower, steadier. "If they are, they've heard me think about this moment for months." Her heart stilled. The storm outside faded into the background. All that remained was the quiet space between them and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Nathaniel brushed a damp strand of hair from her face. "I'm not dying anymore, Evelyn," he whispered. "Not in any way that matters. You brought me back." Her eyes shimmered. "Then don't waste it," she said. "Live. Not for me, for you." He smiled, the kind of smile that felt like sunlight after too many winters. "Maybe it's both," he said. Outside, the storm passed. The air smelled of rain and lavender. In the garden, the new plant stood firm, drops glinting like silver on its small, brave leaves. Nathaniel drew her closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. No grand gestures, no dramatic music, just two people who had finally learned that love didn't need to be loud to be real. Later, as they sat watching the clouds drift away, Evelyn whispered, "You once told me not to expect this house to feel like home." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I was wrong." He looked at her, his voice soft but certain. "You made it one." Autumn painted the Hudson Valley in copper and gold. Leaves drifted over the pond like quiet confetti, and the Cross estate, once a symbol of isolation, had turned into something far softer, a sanctuary. It had been a year since the foundation launch. A year since the board stopped whispering, and since the world began to see Nathaniel Cross not as a ruthless tycoon, but as the man who rebuilt lives, including his own. Every morning he still took his coffee outside, 2 cups balanced carefully on the tray. One for him, one for Evelyn. She always teased him about the habit, but secretly, she loved that he never forgot. The lavender garden was in full bloom, again a sea of purple against the fading green hills. Evelyn knelt near the bench, clipping small bouquets to take to the children's wing at the hospital. "Careful," Nathaniel called from the porch. "You always take too many. Leave some for the bees." She looked over her shoulder, smiling. "I'm leaving plenty. You just like pretending you're a gardener." He chuckled, walking toward her with that quiet confidence that used to look like arrogance. Now it simply looked like peace. They sat together under the oak tree, watching the children play near the fountain patients from the clinic, laughing, chasing bubbles through the crisp air. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" Nathaniel asked. "You were furious at me for refusing therapy." Evelyn laughed. "You were unbearable, arrogant. You even told me not to touch your charts because money could buy better hands." He winced. "I really said that." "You did." Well, he said, smiling, "It's a good thing love doesn't keep receipts." Later that afternoon, they toured the new wing being built on the estate, a rehabilitation center for underprivileged kids. Evelyn ran her fingers over the engraved stone at the entrance. "Second Chance Foundation, established by Nathaniel and Evelyn Cross." She traced their names quietly. "I still can't believe this is ours." "It's everyone's," he said softly. "We just started it." She looked up at him, and for a moment, words weren't necessary. It was all there, the gratitude, the forgiveness, the quiet awe of two people who had nearly lost everything only to find something greater. That evening, the sky blazed orange. Evelyn stood at the porch railing, the scent of coffee and lavender mingling in the air. Nathaniel joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. You know, he said, for the first time in my life, I don't care about tomorrow's meetings or numbers. She leaned her head against him. What do you care about then? He smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. Right now. Winter returned to Hudson Valley quietly, the kind that crept in without warning, a silver breath through the trees, a soft hush over the lavender fields now resting under frost. Inside the Cross estate, the fire crackled and music played low from an old record player. Evelyn sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the snow fall in gentle spirals outside. Nathaniel worked at his desk nearby, glasses sliding down his nose as he signed documents for the foundation. How many more forms until you're free, she teased. He looked up, smirking. Freedom's overrated, but you make the work lighter. She rolled her eyes but smiled because that was Nathaniel, now still witty, still composed, but softer in every way that mattered. Later that evening, they took their usual walk around the frozen pond. The night sky stretched wide above them, stars sharp and clear. Their footsteps crunched on the path dusted with snow. Nathaniel stopped halfway and looked toward the old greenhouse, where a faint glow of golden light shone through the frosted glass. I never replaced the heater after the storm, he said, yet the lavender still survived. I don't know how. Evelyn slipped her hand into his. Maybe it remembered what warmth felt like. He smiled, and in that simple moment, just breath and stillness, it was easy to believe that love really could bring life back from the edge. Months later, the foundation celebrated its first full year. Hundreds of families gathered on the lawn. Children laughed, doctors shared stories, and Nathaniel stood beside Evelyn, his hand resting over hers, as they unveiled a new plaque. To those who remind us that love is not about forever, it's about finding the courage to begin again. Applause rippled through the crowd. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes bright with something that was more than pride, it was peace. You kept your promise, she whispered. So did you, he said. You stayed. That night, after everyone left, they returned to the lavender garden. The air was still the stars endless. Nathaniel knelt, brushing frost from the blossoms. You know, he murmured, when this all began, I thought I was dying. Evelyn crouched beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. You were just not in the way you thought. He smiled, and together they stood beneath the stars, their breath mingling in the cold air, two lives reborn from the ashes of fear and pride. As the camera pulls back, the estate glows beneath the winter sky, a beacon of second chances. The lavender field shimmers pale purple beneath the moonlight, and a single line appears across the screen. True love doesn't heal you once it teaches you how to live again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about love healing and second chances. Because somewhere, someone needs to believe that even the coldest hearts can bloom again.